Hello YouTube. Okay, we'll finish off looking at the paradox of tragedy today, and then this should be my last video on philosophy of art for a while. I'll get back on the meta-ethics series after this. In the last video we looked at the paradox of tragedy, which results from these two facts. As we saw, one family of responses to this are the hedonic compensation theories, according to which we enjoy artworks that produce painful emotions because they also produce pleasurable emotions which compensate for the pain. Hedonic compensation theories have some problems, so in this video we'll look at some other theories. Now, a rather different approach to this is what we might call pure pleasure theories, according to which what we call negative emotions aren't really negative emotions in the first place. The sadness, the fear and so on that we feel in response to artworks, they're not actually negative, at least in the context of art. So a fairly infamous response along these lines is the quasi-emotion theory or pretend theory, which was given by Kendall Walton. Now, I talked about this in my video on the paradox of fiction, which was just a couple of videos ago, so I'll be relatively brief here. If you want more detail, go and watch my paradox of fiction video. But essentially, Walton denies that we experience any emotions at all when we engage with artworks. So, a fortiori, we don't experience any negative emotions. When you read a heartbreaking novel, you don't really feel sadness or pity. When you watch a terrifying film, you don't really feel scared. Rather, you're make-believing, you're pretending to be sad, you're make-believing, you're pretending to be scared. You're not really sad or scared. So Walton points out, look, there are differences between our responses to artworks and our responses to real life. So first of all, our responses to artworks don't depend on existence beliefs. This is just to say that you don't have to believe that the characters in artworks exist in order to have a response to them. But if you think about a sort of real life context, imagine somebody telling you a story about their sister, and she's been through all sorts of terrible tragedies. Maybe she's been abused, and then she got cancer, and then her kid died, etc. She's had a really horrible life. You probably feel very sad for her, and you feel sad for the person telling you about her. But then imagine that he says, I don't actually have a sister. I just made her up. That's just a story. You'd probably stop feeling sad, right? But with artworks, when you approach an artwork, you know that the characters don't really exist. So it doesn't depend on existence beliefs. It seems that usually our emotional responses depend on believing that the person exists. So second, our responses to artworks have different behavioural consequences. For instance, if you were genuinely scared by those creepy girls in The Shining, you'd get up and run out of the cinema. If you genuinely felt pity for Ophelia, you'd run onto the stage to comfort her. Our behavioural dispositions towards fictional characters are completely different to our behavioural dispositions towards real people. Now, for Walton, these kinds of differences suggest that despite the sort of superficial appearance, we don't really feel emotions when we engage with artworks. There's a very simple reason why you don't try to comfort Ophelia. It's because you don't really feel pity for her. Now, obviously, it's not totally make-believe. You do genuinely have a response of sorts. When you read the heartbreaking novel, maybe you will shed real tears. That's not pretend. When you watch the scary film, maybe you have responses that we'd associate with fear, like physiological arousal, a high pulse rate, tense muscles, and so on. But this isn't real fear. This is just quasi-fear. When you cry at the novel or at the play, that's not real sadness, it's quasi-sadness. We pretend or we make believe that the quasi-sadness is real sadness. We pretend or we make believe that the quasi-sadness is real, that the quasi-fear is real fear. Now, this probably sounds a bit ridiculous, and there are many, many problems with this theory. Again, watch the paradox of fiction video, because I explain it all there. But it's obvious how this applies to the paradox of tragedy. On Walton's theory, we don't seek out artworks that provoke negative emotions. In general, we don't feel emotions in response to artworks. Instead, we experience quasi-emotions. And quasi-emotions need not be negative, even if their real counterpart is negative. So sadness feels very bad, so we avoid it. But quasi-sadness can feel very good. Pretending to be sad, make-believing that we're sad, can be a lot of fun. Walton gives an example of a boy being chased by his father, and the father is pretending to be an evil monster. The boy is pretending to be scared. Well, usually being scared is unpleasant, but the boy is having lots of fun here. He's having lots of fun because he's only pretending to be scared. He's not really scared. And that's basically what we're doing when we watch scary movies, according to Walton. As I said, many problems with this, but since I've discussed this before, I'll just mention two particular problems that arise with trying to apply this to the paradox of tragedy. First of all, even if we grant that we only feel quasi-sadness, quasi-fear, quasi-embarrassment and so on, rather than real emotions, who's to say that quasi-sadness, quasi-fear, quasi-embarrassment aren't also negative? This is the problem. When a film makes you feel quasi-sad, this seems to be unpleasant. So it's not good enough just to say you're only experiencing quasi-emotions, not real emotions. We also need to show that the quasi-emotions are somehow necessarily positive. Unless we can flesh the theory out in this way, then we haven't really addressed the paradox. Second, more importantly, it seems undeniable that there are some cases where we definitely do feel emotional responses to artworks. One of my favourite albums ever is Lou Reed's Magic and Loss. Magic and Loss is a very sad album. Lou Reed wrote this album after two close relatives of his had died of cancer, and it's all about illness and death and loss. And Reed doesn't, pull any punches with the lyrics. If you're familiar with Reed's lyrics, you know what he's like. It's blunt and direct. There's no beating about the bush. I'm relatively lucky. I haven't lost any loved ones to cancer, but many people have experienced this. Some of those people have heard this album. Some of them have found it very striking, powerful and moving. Now, in my view, it is totally implausible to say that when these people listen to this album, they're not experiencing real emotions. They're not really sad, it's just quasi-sadness. That's nonsense. Of course they're really sad. The album will be provoking thoughts, of their relatives who died, who may have died in fairly unpleasant ways. And as I said, Reed is very explicit about, the kinds of things that happen with this illness. This album produces real emotions. Go and get the album. Listen to the song Dreamin'. Listen to the lyrics. Could you tell me with a straight face that somebody who's ever had a loved one die won't feel emotions in response to that song? I think that would be... It's just nonsense. So, even if there's something to Walton's theory, it clearly doesn't apply to all cases. There are clearly cases where it doesn't work. Okay, so the control theory was first suggested by Marcia Eaton. According to this theory, emotions which are generally experienced as negative, such as sadness, fear and disgust, can be experienced as positive if we're in control of them. Now, an important element of control is being able to stop experiencing the thing that's causing the emotion. When I read a terrifying book, I can simply put the book down if I get too scared. This won't necessarily completely remove my fear, since I might still think about the book afterwards, but the point is that you decide how much of the stimulus you want to expose yourself to. That's an important element of control. Another important element is your setting. In the right settings, you can maintain a kind of mental control. When you read a fiction, you will, as it were, enter the fictional world. You'll entertain the story and respond to it as if it were real. An important element of control is that the real place where you're really sitting, reading the book, is sufficiently different from the fictional world. This means that when you put the book down, you can quickly remove yourself from the fictional world. You can mentally make the shift back to the real world. If this isn't clear, consider this example. Eaton suggests, imagine sitting in your house reading a horror story, maybe at night, maybe in the day, whatever you're most comfortable with. If you were to get too scared, you could put the book down and bam, you're back in your house in a nice familiar environment. But now suppose you read the book alone at night in a creaky old house that you've never stayed in before. There's a thunderstorm, the air is damp and cold, the power's gone out, so you're reading by candlelight. In this case, many people would find it difficult to remain rational, because when you put the book down, you can't jump back into a safe, familiar environment. For many people, it wouldn't take much for them to become scared, for them to become too scared in this kind of setting. So even though you'd be in control in the sense that you could put the book down or switch the film off, you wouldn't be able to get back into a comfort zone. Of course, some people are less prone to fear than others. Some people would be fine reading a scary book in that kind of setting, but you get the point. It's undoubtedly the case that the ability to control an experience makes the experience less unpleasant. Some experiments with pain tolerance, for instance, have found that the more control people have over the situation, the greater amount of pain they can cope with. If you let people give themselves electric shocks, they can tolerate more severe shocks than if it's somebody else giving them an electric shock. In more everyday life, Eaton gives the example of roller coasters. A roller coaster is enjoyable because we know it's safe, we know it will stay on the tracks, and we also have a pretty good idea of what to expect. There aren't any major surprises with getting on a roller coaster. Even if you haven't seen the track, you know in broad terms what's going to happen. If you imagine losing that control, suppose you hear on an announcement that the safety equipment has failed, then your slight fear would become terror. You wouldn't find the experience remotely enjoyable. So, control is important. When we're in control, we can think about events more deeply. As Eaton points out, I can consider the aesthetic properties of a fire from afar, not so much if I were actually in the fire. I wouldn't be considering how monumental, how striking a forest fire is if my own life were threatened by the fire. As an external observer who's in no danger, we can attend to these properties. And in general, if you're divorced from practical concerns and as long as you're not overly emotional, you'll be able to consider things in a deeper and richer way, even if you might be feeling things like sadness and fear and so on. It's got, as long as it's not an overwhelming sadness or an overwhelming fear, that would be a genuinely negative experience. But you can experience them to a certain extent and still have control over them. Now, artworks are especially well placed to allow us this kind of control for two main reasons. First, as I've already mentioned, you can simply choose to stop engaging with the work if your emotions were to become too intense. You can put the book down, you can switch off the film. Second, the characters don't really exist, and there are no practical actions that we need to do, or even can do, to change the situation. I don't need to leap down to dodge the bullets, I don't need to run in to help the wounded, I don't need to hide from the scary monster. Whenever you engage with an artwork, you're always coming to it as an external observer, like the external observer of the forest fire. You're never going to be in the midst of the fire yourself. Right, so some difficulties for control theory. First, is it really true that we always have this kind of control when we engage with artworks? There are actually some fairly obvious limits to our control. I can't just choose what to feel. If I'm feeling sad, I can't just choose for it to become happiness. Similarly, what about, for instance, a guy who likes to present himself as very macho, but who starts crying during a film and who tries to repress it? It would seem that his reaction to this film is beyond his control. Now, of course, the control theorist could insist at this point that whenever our reactions do go beyond our control, they're no longer pleasant, and they're no longer the reactions that we would seek out. And this is, I guess, pretty plausible in the case of the macho guy crying. Arguably, his experience is no longer pleasant for him. It's certainly not an experience he's seeking out. He's explicitly trying to repress it because he doesn't want other people to see him cry. But there are some cases that are a bit more difficult. So what about when you watch a scary film or read a scary book and still feel scared later? I've mentioned before that one of my favourite horror films is Sinister. This scared me so much I didn't want to go downstairs on my own after I watched it. So, on the one hand, I loved the film. On the other, it's not entirely obvious that I was in control. With all that said, control theory does seem to get something right. After all, the macho guy could just get up and walk away from the film. It's not like, for instance, a relative dying, something you can't get away from. That's something that's truly out of control. I don't think there can be much question that our degree of control over artworks is greater than our control over real life events that might provoke negative emotions, and this has to be part of why we're willing to experience negative emotions in the context of art. Second problem. Remember, control theory attempts to show that emotions that we would usually say are unpleasant can actually be pleasant in the right circumstances. However, we might worry, is it even conceptually possible for fear and sadness and so on to be pleasant? In other words, part of what defines these mental states just is that they're unpleasant. So that to say that sadness is pleasant is like saying the black square is white. There are no circumstances under which a black square could be white. Now, to be fair, I think it would arguably be conceptually impossible for fear or sadness always to be pleasant. If somebody said, yes, I've been sad often and I always enjoy it, we would probably think that they're confused or joking. It's difficult to make sense of the idea of a person who always enjoys being sad. But remember that the control theorist is making a weaker claim. She says only that sadness is sometimes, in specific circumstances, pleasant. And this seems plausible to me. Think about physical pain. Physical pain is the paradigm example of an unpleasant feeling. Burning your hand, getting a slap on the face, being whipped on the back, these don't feel good. Except, of course, they do feel good to plenty of people because there are lots of sexual masochists. You might find that weird or whatever, but it's not conceptually impossible. For me, the biggest problem with control theory is just that it seems explanatorily empty or vacuous. Yes, it does seem to be true that feelings which would usually be negative become less negative the more control we have over them. But what do we learn from this? This just seems like a very trivial claim to me. It's not particularly informative because we still have the question: why would a feeling that's usually unpleasant become pleasurable merely because we have control over it? I mean, I can see why it would become less unpleasant, because it's a general truth about humans that unpleasant things become less unpleasant when we have control over them. But I can't see why it would become positively pleasurable. So why, in the context of artworks, does sadness and fear become pleasurable merely because we have control over them? Control theory seems to get something right, but I don't think it can be the whole story. In any case, the basic claim of pure pleasure theories, that our sadness at tragedy or our fear at a terrifying horror aren't really unpleasant, either because they're quasi-emotions or because the control we have over them somehow makes them positively pleasurable. This claim seems to run counter to common sense. It doesn't really square with the phenomenology of our experience of painful artworks. Recall that hedonic compensation theories say tragedy produces negative emotions. We seek out tragedy because it produces positive emotions that compensate for these. And these pure pleasure theories say tragedy doesn't really produce negative emotions. It's just positive. Quasi-sadness is positive, or normal sadness can become positive through control. Well, it seems to me that the more intuitive thing to say here would be, we want to experience negative emotions. Artworks provoke negative emotions, genuinely negative emotions, and at least sometimes it's these genuinely negative emotions themselves that we want to experience. So maybe we should look for a theory that respects this rather than denies it. I will call these no pleasure theories. According to these theories, we seek out negative emotions and there need be no pleasure involved. We sometimes seek out the displeasurable, the unpleasant, the negative. One theory of this form is discussed by David Hume before he presents his own theory, and he attributes it to L'Abbe du Beau. I think that's how to pronounce his name. It's one of those French names, I'm not sure. But anyway, the idea is that we engage with painful art simply to prevent ourselves becoming bored. Nothing is worse than being bored. If we feel sad or scared, that might not be pleasant, but at least it's not boredom. So on this view, we don't have to say that we enjoy tragedies because they produce positive experiences that compensate for the negative ones. We don't even have to say that the negative ones are somehow become positive. Rather, the negative experiences themselves are what we're after, and we seek these out because it's better than being bored. This theory is obviously fairly inadequate. One point that Hume raises is we wouldn't be pleased if our boredom were resolved by real tragedy. So this theory is clearly incomplete. If all we want is to relieve boredom, why wouldn't we seek out real tragedy? Why wouldn't we kind of just expose ourselves to terrible things going on in the world and feel bad about that? So that's a problem here. We need some explanation of why that is. There are more serious problems. There are many other ways of relieving boredom. If I want to relieve boredom, I don't have to read a sad book or watch a scary movie. I can watch a happy movie. Or I can go for a walk. Or I can play solitaire, etc. So this doesn't really solve our paradox. Maybe feeling sad is better than being bored, but surely feeling happy is much better than both. Why do we relieve boredom by seeking out artworks that provoke negative emotions rather than artworks that provoke positive ones? So this relief from boredom theory doesn't really tell us anything. I suppose we could supplement it with a psychological claim along these lines. We could say, when a person is bored, it's easier for that person to become sad than it is for them to become happy. It's easier to transition from boredom to a negative emotion than from boredom to a positive emotion. This would explain why we watch a sad movie to relieve boredom. But this simply seems implausible to me. I'm not sure how you'd go about defending this claim. Certainly the burden at this point is on the relief from boredom theorist to provide some sort of argument for this. But if you could defend this claim, then I guess that would make relief from boredom theory rather more plausible. The main problem for this theory is simply that I'm often not bored when I engage with a painful artwork. I know from my own experience that I've often put on a film that I know will make me sad or will make me scared when I'm not feeling bored at the time, and when I'm probably not going to start feeling bored even if I don't watch the film. For me, at any rate, boredom is actually kind of rare. It's not something I worry about that much. I don't ask myself in the morning, oh God, what am I going to do today to avoid boredom? I just get on with stuff. I mean, who really worries about boredom that much? It seems like you'd be worried about boredom if you were, I don't know, some major adrenaline junkie. But I think for most people, it's not something we're that worried about having to avoid every moment of our lives. We don't do things just to avoid boredom. We do things because we just want to. They just seem fun or whatever. So this isn't a very plausible theory. But one interesting point about this theory is that we don't ever seek out boredom. We seek out all these other negative emotions, but not boredom. Of course, there may be some unusual cases. Andy Warhol supposedly said that he liked to be bored. I'm not sure how seriously I can take that, though. I don't know. He might have just been joking there. Maybe there are some, weird people who do like boredom, but in general, generally speaking, most people never seek out boredom. So, while this theory isn't a very persuasive answer to the paradox, it does draw attention to this interesting fact that boredom seems to be something different. In fact, boredom seems to be the only kind of negative emotion that we don't seek out. Fear, sadness, disgust, anger, embarrassment, all of those, great. If an artwork produces those, we're fine, but not boredom. It's also interesting to consider this with regard to the previous theories. So, regarding hedonic compensation theories, hedonic compensation never makes up for boredom. A lot of people find 2001: A Space Odyssey boring. They may agree that it has many virtues. The striking cinematography, the philosophical themes, the sort of innovative narrative structure, whatever. But it's a very slow-paced film with very little dialogue, and it bores them. There's just no compensating for that. If an artwork bores you, you're not going to like the experience. You won't seek it out again, no matter how many virtues it has. So that's the pretend or quasi-emotion theory. Well, have you ever been made quasi-bored by an artwork? Is that pleasant? Is the quasi-boredom that you feel in response to artworks any more pleasurable than real boredom? Presumably not. So quasi-boredom is something very different, it seems, from quasi-fear, quasi-sadness, quasi-embarrassment. Control theory. When an artwork makes you bored, you have control over the boredom, since you can get up and do something else. But obviously that doesn't make the boredom pleasurable. So all these theories seem to hit trouble when it comes to boredom. Boredom seems to be something very different to other negative emotions, and none of the other theories that we've looked at have quite captured that. Okay. The last theory that I'm going to look at is the rich experience theory. which has mainly been defended by a guy called Aaron Smuts. In a nutshell, this theory claims that we don't tend to avoid negative emotions. We're not motivated only to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Rather, what we seek are rich experiences, whether these experiences are positive or negative. So what exactly is a rich experience as opposed to a plain old experience? Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely clear what this distinction involves. It's not been made totally clear to me from what I've read what exactly a rich experience is supposed to be, but I don't think this really matters. I don't think we need to define it precisely. Think about an everyday experience. Right now, you're, presumably sitting at home, maybe looking at a computer screen, you've got familiar clothes on, maybe you've just eaten some familiar food, you're not in any special state of arousal, you're just having a kind of everyday experience. A rich experience is one that involves novel and unfamiliar things. It has some deep meaning or significance to your life. It involves engaging your capacities of empathy and imagination. It produces states of heightened arousal, heightened emotion. Maybe the colloquial way of putting it might be that a rich experience is one that makes you feel alive. It's one where you get the most out of the moment. And it need not be one thing. A rich experience might unfold over a period of time, so that particular experiences and moods and emotions all become part of a larger, rich experience. Artworks provide us with rich experiences. A great book will draw you in. It should provide novel and unfamiliar things. It should have some meaning to you. It should provoke heightened emotions. Why do we seek out artworks that cause negative emotions? Indeed, why is it that artworks that cause the most powerful negative emotions, the most powerful feelings of sadness, why are they among the ones we consider the best? Because we seek out rich experiences, whether they're positive or negative, and a feeling of powerful sadness is at least part of a rich experience. Now you might be thinking, okay, so why don't we have the same desire for these negative rich experiences in real life? Well, according to the rich experience theory, we do desire them in real life. Remember, according to this theory, we don't avoid negative emotions. This is a general claim. We value rich experiences, whether they're positive or negative, and we value them in general. So, a fortiori, we value them when they're afforded by artworks. Even in real life, we don't avoid negative emotions. Even outside the context of art, we don't avoid negative emotions. So there are 2 points to consider here that should make this more plausible. First, there are actually many obvious contexts outside of art where we seek negative rich experiences. An obvious example it would be people who take part in extreme sports. Mountaineering can be extremely dangerous. I think something like a fifth of the people who've tried to summit Annapurna have died doing so. Maybe a tenth of the people who've tried to summit Everest have died. Not only do these mountaineers experience fear, but they're in genuine danger, unlike just reading or watching a movie. They do it because it's part of a rich experience. And incidentally, it's not just the fear that's unpleasant. All sorts of things about mountaineering are quite nasty. The sorts of effects it has on your body, it can play hell with your bowels, it can irritate your skin, it's cold, you've got to carry around lots of uncomfortable bags and equipment. But for many mountaineers, all of this stuff is an important part of the experience. For a more mundane example, consider eating a hot chili. You know it's hot, you know what it's going to do, you know you'll hate it, but you do it anyway, because it's novel, it's a rich experience. Second, the problem with seeking negative emotions outside of art is that generally these emotions can only be had at a significant cost. It's simply a matter of prudence. You don't choose to experience fear by climbing into the bear cage at the zoo simply because the risks to your physical safety far outweighs the reward of experiencing fear. You don't break up with your girlfriend in order to experience sadness because you'll lose someone very important to you. Films, books, paintings, these are all perfectly safe. Some people want to get a bit further out their comfort zone. They do extreme sports like mountaineering. For the rest of us, artworks are an easy and safe way to explore our negative emotions. Remember I noted earlier that the relief-from-boredom theory draws attention to the point that boredom is something we never seek out. None of us ever like being bored, and we don't like artworks that provoke boredom. If an artwork makes you extremely sad or extremely scared, we'd probably consider it one of the best. But to be made extremely bored is just about, that's one of the worst results possible. This is easily accounted for by the rich experience theory. Part of what defines boredom is precisely that it's the exact opposite of a rich experience. Boredom is a state of simply being uninterested in what's going on. Nothing is grabbing you, nothing is striking you. It's like watching paint dry, as they say. That's what boredom feels like. So rich experience theory copes with boredom much better than any of the other theories. We saw that boredom was a problem for all the other theories, but it seems like rich experience theory copes with it very well. What about some problems then? Well, first of all, are all of the negative experiences that we seek rich? It doesn't always take much to provoke fear or disgust, for instance. Often horror films will just make you jump. They'll do a sudden shot of the monster and a loud noise, and that simply shocks you. It's a cheap and easy way of provoking fear. This doesn't seem especially rich, but there are people who clearly value these experiences. Well, there are 2 points we could make here. First, we could say that these are just parts of an overall rich experience. So a horror film might have lots of cheap scares, but it will also develop an atmosphere, it will develop more long-term tension, and all of these things, plus the cheap scares, will add up to an overall rich experience. Second, we could argue that the concept of rich experience is just very broad. It can include experiences like just any experience that is sort of novel to us, any experience that you wouldn't have on an everyday basis. And you don't tend to get sudden shocks on an everyday basis. Rich experience doesn't necessarily mean that the experience is kind of detailed. It's just, something not everyday. A more important problem: why should it matter if the experiences are rich? Why should that make us want them? Why would we desire to have a negative experience just because it's rich? I mean, unless we can answer this question, we haven't really solved the paradox. But I think the answer to this is actually fairly simple. It's simply a brute fact about humans that we want rich experiences of various kinds. There need not be any further reason here. We simply want a life that's full of a variety of different kinds of experiences. That's just what humans are like biologically. We desire to experience a variety of things. Why exactly humans have evolved this way would be a question maybe for evolutionary biologists or evolutionary psychologists. I think there are some pretty plausible explanations for why we might have evolved this way. I won't go into them, that's not relevant to the philosophical point that we're making here. Although one thing that is worth noting is humans are very curious and intelligent animals. And in general, intelligent creatures tend to seek out a variety of experiences, whether they're positive or negative. Crows, for instance, are extremely intelligent birds, but they'll often put themselves in danger for fun. I saw a video on YouTube a little while ago of a crow irritating a dog, and the dog was trying to eat it. If it got it, it would have killed it. But the crow was like flying right up to it and then quickly flying away. So this kind of exposure to negative experiences is actually something that you see in many intelligent species of animal. It's not just humans, which is worth bearing in mind. I suppose the biggest problem for this theory is that it rests on what seems to be a fairly extreme violation of common sense. Remember, according to this theory, in general, we don't try to avoid negative emotions. We don't try to avoid fear, sadness, embarrassment, disgust. And this is a fairly extreme claim, because it certainly seems that we try to avoid negative emotions. The rich experience theorists will need to explain why it seems this way. So one kind of response here is that we are essentially confusing ourselves. So the idea here is, look, what we avoid in real life are not the negative emotions themselves, but particular causes of the negative emotions. It's tempting to say that we prefer to avoid being sad, because when you consider the times that you've ever been sad, it's usually caused by something that you'd want to avoid. And we're confusing the desire to avoid what's caused X with the desire to avoid X. We're confusing the desire to avoid an event that's caused sadness with a desire to avoid sadness. So let's think about the sorts of things that make you sad. I'm sad because I expected to have some chocolate cake for pudding, but I discover that it's all gone off. It's gone mouldy or stale, whatever. More seriously, you might be sad because a close relative has died. When you consider the sorts of things that make you sad, you'll probably think of cases like this. But notice that the natural thing to say about these cases isn't that we want to avoid being sad. Rather, we want to avoid having our desire for chocolate cake be frustrated. We don't want the cake to be mouldy. We'd prefer it if the cake was still in prime condition. Similarly, we want to avoid losing close relatives. We don't want the people we love to get sick and die. So notice that the problem in both of these cases, what we object to in both of these cases, isn't the negative emotion itself, but the actual events that the negative emotion is a response to. It may be worth considering, in these cases, would you want the sadness to go away? Suppose you've just lost a relative, and a genie pops up and tells you he can magic away your sadness. Would you agree to that? Most people, I think, wouldn't, because if a relative has died, you should be feeling sad. That's an entirely appropriate response. There'd be something wrong with someone who didn't feel sad about that. There'd be something missing, that wouldn't be right. What we evaluate negatively is our relatives dying. That's what we want to avoid, not feeling sad about our relatives dying. Here's another confusion we might be making. Most of the things that cause negative emotions are things we want to avoid. So we assume that, in general, if something causes a negative emotion, it's something we'd want to avoid. But this is kind of obviously false. I mean, it's not that we avoid things that cause negative emotions. We avoid particular bad things. We avoid loss. We avoid things that are physically threatening. We avoid things that frustrate our plans. But there are some things that cause negative emotions that aren't especially bad, and we have no reason to avoid them. Which is, of course, why artworks are so alluring. We get the negative emotions without the badness of the usual causes. And this is really just to repeat what I said earlier. Artworks allow us to explore our negative emotions in a safe environment. So, another objection is that this theory rests on an untenable philosophy of mind. Rich experience theorists say that we seek negative emotions, we seek things that cause negative emotions. But you might respond, look, to say that an emotion is negative just is to say that we are motivated to avoid that thing. Just is to say that we're motivated to avoid that emotion. And to say that something causes a negative emotion just is to say that we're motivated to avoid that thing. After all, how else are you supposed to demarcate an emotion as negative? What else can you appeal to if not people's actual behaviour? We have to look at what people seek out, at what people avoid, and this tells us what the sorts of things people consider pleasant or unpleasant. You wouldn't say that something was unpleasant if you were just constantly seeking it out. If somebody was constantly avoiding something, we surely wouldn't say that they consider that thing pleasant. There's some truth to this, of course, but I think that this kind of objection is too strong. Consider the point I made earlier about pain. Some people seek physical pain. And physical pain is as clear an example of an unpleasant feeling that you'll get, but in certain contexts there are people who seek it out. Just as you can seek out unpleasant feelings, you can seek out unpleasant emotions. Now, obviously there is a connection between the pleasantness of an emotion and our behaviour with regard to it. This connection can be captured just by saying that usually if we find an emotion unpleasant, we're motivated to avoid it, or usually if something causes an unpleasant emotion, we're motivated to avoid that thing. Why is this usually the case? Well, just because of the risks that I noted before. These unpleasant emotions are usually warnings of or responses to dangers and losses. And of course we want to avoid dangers and losses, so that means we end up usually avoiding these emotions. The mark of a negative emotion is simply that it usually occurs as a warning of or a response to a danger or loss of some kind. But it doesn't have to occur like that. And so in those contexts, we can seek it out, we can desire it. Another potential problem is, if it's true that we don't avoid negative emotions, what about things like depression? Some people simply feel depressed, where this hasn't been caused by anything bad. In fact, depression is such that it doesn't really make any difference what's going on in your life. You could be in a great relationship, earning loads of money, have a big house, a job you love. If you have depression, you're going to be miserable. So if it's true that we don't tend to avoid negative emotions, only certain bad causes of negative emotions, why would having depression be a problem? Nothing bad is happening in your life, you're just undergoing a negative emotion, so why would that be a problem? But of course, clearly depression is a problem, so this is a bit of a difficulty for the rich experience theory. I think what the rich experience theorist would say to this is that the problem with depression is simply the intensity and duration of the emotion is inappropriate to the extent that it interferes with your life. It's not so much the negativity of the emotion that's important. I suppose we could appeal to the control theory here and note that depression is totally outside of your control. You can't stop it, it never goes away, it consumes everything else. This is the kind of thing that can be a problem even with positive experiences. I remember seeing a news report about some woman who had a medical condition that caused her to have constant orgasms. She was orgasming all the time. She had to have sex constantly, just trying to bang every guy she saw. Now, an orgasm is a very pleasant feeling, but none of us would want to have it all the time. And it's a similar problem with things like depression. In fact, even with depression, there's bipolar depression, isn't there, where people will switch between kind of sadness and hopelessness on the one hand and great joy and exhilaration on the other. But the elevated phase, the joyful phase, is just as much part of the illness as the depressed phase. So anyway, that's rich experience theory. I hope I wasn't too repetitive in explaining that. It felt like I went over the same ground many times. It's just I think that the central claim here, that in general we seek out negative emotions, that can seem a bit ridiculous at first. I don't think it is so ridiculous. In fact, I find this theory quite attractive, but it does need some fleshing out. Well, anyway, that's about it for this video. The last thing I want to point out is that we could be pluralists about this. We could appeal to various different theories to explain different emotions in different contexts. As I just noted, rich experience theorists can appeal to control theory to help answer objections. In fact, there's not really any question that we should be pluralists. I don't find compensation theories especially plausible because it seems obvious to me that we seek out the sadness itself, the fear itself, and so on, and not just other positive experiences that compensate for these. But there are obvious cases where compensation theory is correct. One of the most painful books I've ever read is American Holocaust by David Stannard, which is a historical book about the genocide of Native Americans. I read this book for its educational value. I wanted to learn about history. It was extremely disturbing, but the educational value compensated for that. So as I mentioned in the video on the paradox of fiction, philosophers like to have simple theories. They like to give single, unified accounts of particular phenomena. But really, simple theories are appropriate only if the phenomena you're trying to explain is simple. And emotions aren't simple. They're messy and complex. So I think we can draw on many theories to help explain the paradox of tragedy. And maybe it's best not to think of it as a formal paradox at all. It's really just the question of why are we attracted to artworks that make us feel bad? And when you put the question that way, when you just ask, why are we attracted to artworks that make us feel bad? Well, it should be obvious that there are going to be many answers to this. Anyway, that's it. That's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.